back, philosophers. In this video I'm going to give a brief intro over 3 arguments that are going to be presented in chapters 3 and 4 of our dialogue. So the first 2 arguments are going to be presented in chapter 3 and the last one will be in chapter 4. So the first argument we're going to look at is called the ontological argument. So the ontological argument was first put forward by Anselm of Canterbury in his work called the Proslogion. His argument, in fact, only takes up about 2 pages in his massive tome, and he has a huge body of work. But this argument that takes up about 2 pages of his work far and away became his most famous contribution to philosophy, even though he's within philosophy and theology, he's known for other important ideas. But this ontological argument was probably his most important contribution. So what his argument basically says is that God is the being that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And Anselm thought that just based on this definition, if God was this, then God must exist, sort of by necessity, almost by definition. So we'll look at that argument, walk through some of the logic of it in here. So the second argument we're going to look at is called the argument from contingency. Now the argument from contingency argues that God is the best explanation for the existence of the universe. We've talked about the abductive form of many of these arguments. So the data is going to be that the universe exists, and the claim is going to be, well, we need to ask the question, why does it exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And Leibniz, in his formulation, is going to argue that God is the best explanation for why anything exists. So a form of this argument was presented by Aquinas in his Summa Theologiae, but we're going to focus on the formulation by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who's this wonderfully pictured man here with a wonderful wig. Leibniz presents his argument in his Theodicy, which I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but he actually introduces the word theodicy, which we'll get to that later when we talk about the problem of evil. So one part of his argument I want to talk about here is he makes an important distinction between contingent beings and necessary beings. And I'll talk about this in the book, but I want to talk about this here. So contingent beings are things that could possibly not exist. So something is a contingent thing if it could or could not exist. So pretty much everything that we run into in our everyday lives is a contingent thing. I'm a contingent thing. It's possible that I didn't exist. It's possible that my parents never met. It's possible that my parents did meet, but only very briefly. It's possible they met and got married, but decided not to have kids. All these things could be the case, in which case I wouldn't exist. So I am a contingent being because even though I do exist, I could possibly not exist. Whereas necessary beings could not possibly not exist. Necessary beings must exist. So by their nature, they have to exist. So this important distinction is going to play a role in Leibniz's argument. And the final argument we're going to look at, this is in chapter 4, is the fine-tuning argument. So the fine-tuning argument argues that God is the best explanation for the universe being finely tuned for human life. So part of your homework is going to be to find one of these fine-tuned parts of nature. So one of those famous versions of this argument comes from William Paley, who was alive in the late 1700s, and he used this analogy of a watchmaker, that if you find a watch in the forest or something, the best explanation for why the watch is there, because there's so much complexity, because it's so finely tuned to work just right, is that there is a watchmaker, that there's some intelligent design there. So this argument has gone in and out of vogue. Newton and Descartes were very fond of the watchmaker argument in their time, as was Paley. But it was considered sort of a dead argument after The Origin of Species was published. It was thought that sort of Darwin's evolutionary theory provided all the explanatory power to explain all this finely tuned biological life in us without resorting to an intelligent designer. But this argument has seen a recent revival as, one, people begin to understand Paley's argument as a little more of a nuanced argument. But also as more examples of fine-tuning are found, both within physics and in chemistry and life outside of biology. So we're going to examine these 3 arguments for the existence of God. These will be the final 3 we look to that are in favor of the existence of God. So get your questions in as soon as possible, and we'll start discussing whether we think these arguments are sound or not.